I've studied corruption for nearly 15 years now, and if there's one thing that I've learned during all this time is that corruption is hard to define, it's hard to measure, and it's really hard to tackle. But it's easy to spot it when you see it. So basically, people are able to recognize corruption or misbehavior associated with corruption whenever they encounter it, especially when they see it in other people's behaviors. Let me give you some examples. I grew up in Romania, and I remember as a kid, my grandma used to take me with her whenever she was visiting her GP. And I remember I was always so surprised that my grandma would bring a gift with her to the GP. And I remember that clearly because usually the gift was a home-baked cake. And as a child, I would always look at it and wanted to taste it. Fast forward 20 years later, I'm having a walk in a park with one of my best friends who confided in me that she was so happy with her new job. So I asked her how did she get the job, because she was working in a very prestigious Western media company. And she said she got the job because her husband knew the owner of the media company very well, and he was able to get her the job through this connection. Now, these are almost very small instances of behaviors that might be associated with corruption or informality or sort of an economy of favors, let me put it like that. But how are these behaviors different, for example, from a politician who is lobbying a public servant in order to give a contract, for them to give a contract to a company in which the politician is a shareholder? Or how is this different from a politician awarding directly contracts to his or her own friends? You see, these are instances in which it's very easy for us to say, okay, this is corruption. So today I'm here to talk to you about how to spot corruption and how to tackle corruption. It's as simple as that. And I'm going to start by explaining what corruption is, how much corruption is out there, and then I'm going to move into explaining what you can do about it and what are the benefits of deciding not to engage in corrupt practices. But let's start with the beginning. So how much corruption is out there? And I put here a map of corruption around the world. The map is produced by Transparency International, and it's based on an instrument called the Corruption Perception Index, which essentially ranks countries around the world according to the level of corruption. Visually, this map shows you which areas are most associated with corruption. And the way to read the map is the darker the color, the more corruption there is in that, perceived corruption there is in that particular country. So now you might think that if you are associated with a country that is yellow, or if you are a national of that country, or if you live in that country, you are in a very fortunate position. Well, let me tell you that's not the case, because like anything else in life, this instrument is also not perfect. So it doesn't really capture corruption happening at the highest echelons of power, or it doesn't capture accidental or incidental acts of corruption. It's very good for capturing systemic corruption, but not everything. Let me now give you a sense of what I understand by the concept of corruption. Like I said, it's very hard to define it, but essentially, as far as I'm concerned, corruption means sort of the intersection of three key actors. A person a public servant, let's say, or a person who's entrusted with power, who aims to obtain some sort of gain, and in doing so violates the norms of the office, thus harming a second key actor, which is essentially the public or the people who have entrusted him or her with the power, in order to give access to goods and services to a third party that would otherwise not have access to these goods and services, in exchange for some sort of benefit, may it be material or not. So, in a nutshell, corruption might be the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Now, you might legitimately think, what does this have to do with me? So I'm not in a position of power, I'm not a public servant, I don't want to be, and so what does this have to do with me? But let me ask you, have you ever applied for a job using your parents' connections? Have you ever considered buying an essay from an essay mill or cheating in an exam? Or have you ever been paid cash in hand? Have you ever used connections to obtain favors from a public servant? Have you used the information from your job? Have you passed it on to other people who could have benefited from that? You see, if you've done any of these things, you have been engaged in practices that can easily and broadly be put under the umbrella of corruption. And one of the most important things about corruption is that it's important to recognize whenever this happens, because by actively engaging in these practices, we're contributing to the societal norms. So if we live in a corrupt society, we contribute to the reproduction of that practical norm, which might be to give bribes to whatever, civil servants or police officers. And if we live in a society that is not characterized by rampant corruption, we might actually be involved in essentially creating new norms and putting institutionalizing new practices, new informal practices of behavior. So essentially we become agents in creating our own environment, and that environment is essentially unfair, is corrupt. So what do you think we could do? What can we do to avoid that? Well, there are a few things that I would recommend. First of all, choose not to be involved in corrupt practices. Choose to act with integrity. Again, this might not be as easy as it sounds, because if you live in a very corrupt society, choosing to act with integrity and, for example, not pay a bribe might come at a price. And sometimes the price might be higher than just paying a bribe. So a fine might be higher than a bribe. In other more dramatic instances, you could be excluded from your close circle of friends because you choose to not to follow the norm of the group. But there are also rewards for that, so bear that in mind. I'll come back to this in a bit. The second thing that you can do is, after not engaging in corrupt practices, is reporting them. So essentially, whenever you see something wrong happening, something that might be associated with corruption, I suggest you to report it to the police or make a complaint or blow the whistle or leak it to the press, do something. Basically, just don't be a passive observer to what's happening around you. Because if you choose not to do anything about that particular situation, you are essentially becoming a contributor to the perpetuation of that norm in the society or in that particular context in which you live. Last but not least, my third recommendation about engaging is to check the sources of the stories that you read. We live in an era of social media, and we get most of our information about corruption or anything else in the world via our social networks. So it's very easy these days to be exposed to fake news, and these take a huge toll on the ways we perceive our societies, and based on those perceptions, how we act in our societies. So this recommendation of checking your sources and seeing how reliable these are is very important in order to have a more informed image about what is happening in the social context in which you live. And if you do so, if you do all these things, there are some benefits for the society in general, but also for you as a person. So, for example, if you choose to get involved in corrupt practices, you might benefit in the short run or even long run. Remember the case of my friend who still has the job in that company, in that media company after so many years. Or if you're a politician who awards contracts to his or her friends, obviously you will be rewarded. So there are long-term benefits. But at the same time, if you choose to not engage in these corrupt practices, you are contributing to creating your own career based on meritocracy. You are constructing yourself as a human being and as a professional based on traits that are respectable and respected outside of your inner circle. So in summary, corruption is not something that happens just out there to some people. Corruption is based on the choices we make at behavioral level in our everyday interaction. And even if sometimes a choice to engage in corrupt practices might seem reasonable at a personal level, at societal level it might have dramatic consequences, negative consequences. So in order to tackle this, I would strongly encourage everyone to take responsibility for your own action, to look at yourself and see if what you are doing is in line with your values and if you're acting with integrity in your everyday interactions. And now I would like to leave you with a thought, and this is based on an example that I consider a success story in terms of changing behavior and acting with integrity. The example is related to India, which is a very strong emerging economy, but also it's a country characterized by high levels of perceived corruption. Research has shown, for example, that in 2019, around 50% of the inhabitants of this country have been at some level involved in corruption. In this context, there is an initiative which is called IPayTheBribe.com, which is a social media outlet that encourages people to report whenever they pay a bribe and also report the amount that they pay. I particularly like this initiative. So this was put out around 10 years ago, and I think it has more than 15 million reports by now. So I really like this initiative because this encourages people to report acts of corruption. It focuses on small corruption, on what we call typically petty corruption that happens in everyday interactions. It doesn't necessarily focus on a public figure. It doesn't vilify anyone, but it focuses on deeply changing the structures and the patterns of corruption in a particular society, because it first exposes them, and secondly, it offers citizens tools to teach them to become more aware of it, and secondly, not to engage in corrupt practices, to act with more integrity. And I think that's a very valuable lesson for all of us to learn.